History repeats itself. Where did that come from, that idea that history repeats itself? And what can we learn if we go back? It is always interesting to me. I'm not really interested in history the way, let's say, Jesse is. I kind of want to go into the future and look ahead. Looking back, it feels frustrating. Although I know we have to look back in order to understand where we are, in order to possibly change where we might go. So, just some food for thought.
Thank you so much for spending time with us, Camila.
Sure.
We really appreciate it.
No, thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad.
Tell us a little bit about yourself very quickly, what your area of expertise is.
I am a professor of history at Rutgers University, very near New York City. I have been studying the Nahuatl or Aztec language since the late 1990s, and that study has allowed me to look very closely at the historical annals that the Aztecs wrote for their own grandchildren and their own great-grandchildren right after the conquest, and it has been very illuminating. I've written some other books too about Native Americans, people like Pocahontas, for instance, someone that your listeners know all about. But I've tried to do those projects from the point of view of the indigenous people who are at the heart of them. It's harder when we don't have sources, but I try to do both kinds of projects, kind of weaving back and forth between them as I can.
So Camila, people think of the Aztecs as just one group. They were all the same, but they weren't all the same, were they?
They were not all the same. In fact, we don't even know exactly which of the many different kinds of people who lived in Mesoamerica we mean when we say Aztecs. Do we mean just the people who lived on that island in the middle of the lake and conquered all the others? Or do we mean the other tribes that surrounded them, some of whom were friends, some of whom were enemies? Or do we mean everyone who lived in Mesoamerica? Because after all, the Aztecs conquered people as far away as El Salvador.
Mm-hmm.
So that word Aztecs, it encompasses a lot of territory.
So Camila, how did you get interested in the Aztecs?
Right. People always ask me, what's a nice girl like you doing in that part of town sort of thing. But when I go to Mexico, they ask me, what's a gringo like you doing studying our history? I cannot answer that question easily. I have as far as I know, no genetic blood content that is indigenous, nothing whatsoever. And of course, I could give the kind of typical answer that I've always been interested since I was a kid, which is certainly true, but a lot of us have a lot of interest when we're kids and we don't necessarily grow up to be that thing. So I think one thing that happened was when I was just finishing up my PhD and starting out as a young professor, I, on a whim, sort of took a summer language course in Nahuatl, the Aztec language. I just wanted to see what it was like. I thought it would be too hard for me, honestly. And I found out that I was good at it. And then I found out how many documents, how many writings there were in this language. We always say we can't know the ancient indigenous point of view because they didn't write anything, but they did. I mean, the Mayas wrote all over those stelae and those buildings. And then the Aztecs, right after the conquest, took this Roman alphabet and began to use it to write down all sorts of things in their language. So I think it was the realization that I could look through this window and begin to hear these people talking that made me more interested than I ever had been before.
Now, did you start by studying it from afar? When was the first time you actually went to a real Aztec place, not just like a place where they had some artifacts here or there, but like really went to the place?
I would have been in college as a very young person growing up in New York. I was trotted around to all the museums, but that's not the same thing at all. Okay. When I was in college, I went to Mexico and visited many of the sites. Okay. At that time, I hadn't been in any indigenous villages where they still speak indigenous languages. There are many, but at that time I just went, I was a college student touring the archaeological sites. It was only later as a full adult that I actually visited towns and places where Nahuatl, where the Aztec language is still spoken.
You know, I always hear, I mean, I don't know about you, Priscilla, but I always hear that all the language disappeared. Why is that the common view, that we can't understand this history?
Right. It is true that many languages on this earth are threatened with extinction. And it is true that there are fewer and fewer speakers of Nahuatl or Aztec with each generation. But there are still 1.5 million of them in Mexico. And in fact, there are probably a couple 100,000 here in the United States. You know, some of the migrants are in fact indigenous, and so they speak not only Spanish but also an indigenous language, and a few of them speak Nahuatl. So even though it is true that in some ways that language, like other threatened languages, are facing death, it's also true that more than ever before, people are trying to do something about that, are trying to keep it alive among their children, teach it in schools, etc. So it is a myth that it's all gone. I think part of the problem, though, over time has been that historians, scholars, archaeologists, most of the people doing the official studying and writing the official books did not themselves study indigenous languages. They studied Spanish and they read the scholarship by the Germans and the French, but they thought it was okay to study indigenous people without speaking their language. I mean, in retrospect, it's a little silly, but at the time, it was kind of the best we could all do. And so there was a sense that, yes, there were these writings out there, but who knows what they say. And then even when people did begin to read them, with some seriousness in the 1950s, some Mexicans got serious about it in the 50s, and some North Americans in the 60s and 70s, even then, there was a tendency to dismiss what was in the sources a little too hastily as interesting, poignant, sweet, but not necessarily communicative of real information, because they were hard to understand. When you first read one of these Aztec histories that I read, I have to say, it's hard for an outsider to understand it. Their conventions are not our conventions. They weren't writing them for Europeans. They really didn't care if you and I could understand it. That wasn't the point. So you have to be patient and read lots of them. And so people tended to gravitate towards other kinds of sources. So even though the language is not dead, and certainly was not dead when all these studies were started, there are real reasons that make it make sense that people concluded it was all lost to us, so to speak. But it isn't.
And in these stories, you know, you see multiple points of view around the same subjects. You know, people are going away, people are staying. The stories are written, you know, from different perspectives. Does that make it harder to find the truth, or whatever the truth means?
Yes, you've put your finger right on the crux of the issue as far as these histories are concerned. Most of them were written from the vantage point of a particular altepetl, like a city-state or community. You can think of ancient Greece. It's like one was written from the point of view of a certain neighborhood in Sparta, and another one from a certain neighborhood in Athens. So you can't be sure what's going on throughout the peninsula of Greece if you're just getting the perspective of this place or that place.
Mm-hmm.
And partly for that reason, some scholars said, oh, they're just sort of highly individualized propagandistic pieces. But I find that that's not entirely true. There was likewise a tradition of having different family members or different families, or sometimes even different neighborhoods or different towns step forward and describe the same event from their point of view. This was all part of helping people feel that there was a there, that there was a togetherness, that they, something that they could put together, like that we might think of as a mini nation. And that this project of making people feel like they belong to something bigger than themselves would work better if they called on different people's points of view. Well, once I began to see that, I began to see that you really could get a sense of what the larger city-state was going through. And then if you read more than one of these histories, you can put it all together and get a sense of what the larger area was experiencing. You have to take it with a grain of salt. Different city-states may all claim that the same heroine was born in their town, and you have to conclude, well, we'll never know where the heroine was born for sure. But that still doesn't take away from the fact that we've just figured out that they had this heroine that they all liked and why that was. So,
a lot of the stories, not that I've really read any, but I feel like from your own writings that it's almost like telling the story of Odysseus or the Aeneid, where they're not quite creation myths, but they're a society needs these mythological stories to be able to have a common point of view. Is that why they were written?
I think absolutely that's why they were started. That is, almost all of the texts begin with something like you're describing, that the wanderers come down from the north, because the Aztecs did originate in what we think of as the Southwest, the far north for them. So in the beginning of these stories, the wanderers come down and their gods are helping them, and they experience danger and they surmount it, or some of them die. It does sometimes make you think of Odysseus, or occasionally of Beowulf, because they fight with terrible beings too. But then at a certain point, they turn to more recent times when these history tellers either were speaking of their own lives or their fathers' and grandfathers' lives, more recent generations. And then I think the point becomes something a little different. Then the point is helping people figure out which larger entity they belong to, helping people feel committed to that larger. It becomes more of there's a political agenda as opposed to a kind of mytho-historic need that's being met. And then sometimes these are carried on into what we call the colonial period, that is the 16 and 1700s, when the Spaniards were there, long after the conquest. And then it becomes much more newsy. That is, the town just experienced this great hurricane-like wind, or such and such a woman, the wife of the chief, has died and we're all going to miss her. So you can you can pass through a period in these stories where it really is a kind of ancient tale of origins and a kind of Bildungsroman, a kind of story of arriving to greatness, and then pass through a period where they're trying to convince the listeners that we all belong to this, and should belong and want to belong together and in and of this city-state. And then if it becomes more, post-conquest, as we call it, more modern, it can become almost like a newsletter about what's going on. We've actually learned some things about what life was like in Mexico in the colonial period, because the Spaniards don't tell us some things that the Indians were interested in.
How important for this documentation was the Spaniards' conquest? Because didn't they try and educate people, and then the byproduct of that was, that they wrote down these stories?
Yes, there's a real irony there. The Spanish friars taught these indigenous boys, and they were mostly boys, as far as we know, the Roman alphabet so that they could study the Bible and become good Christians. And many of them did do that, but they also realized quite quickly sort of the beauty and power of a phonetic system. The Aztecs had pictographic writing. It wasn't as complex as Maya writing, but it was complex enough for their purposes. But it didn't transcribe sound. They would have a series of glyphs that were designed to, like mnemonic devices, they were designed to help a history teller or a priest remember what he was supposed to say. But these young students of the friars quickly realized this was an awesome technology, in effect, the transcription of sound with these little symbols. So they took it home. And they asked grandma and grandpa, tell us the prayers you used to tell, or tell us the histories you used to tell. And they wrote down all sorts of things that the Spaniards had no idea they were writing down. Some of them the Spaniards wouldn't have minded. In other cases, they would have been shocked and horrified because they didn't want, for example, the old prayers to be written down. But it became a kind of subversive tool, if you will. That is, I don't know that they were conscious of that. Some of them probably were, some of them weren't. But these young and indigenous men were using it to write down their own history outside of the radar of the Spaniards. And as a result, we have all sorts of wonderful documents that give us a window into their lives. Up till now, the documents that have been studied mostly have been the ones that were written with and for the Spanish friars. They're called codices. You've probably heard of the Florentine Codex or this or that codex. And that the Spaniards would ask, what was the god of war like? And they would say, his name was Huitzilopochtli, and this is what he looked like. But these other texts are things that they wrote in the privacy of their own homes with grandpa and grandma, just using the Roman alphabet, kind of against the purposes that the Spanish friars had imagined. It's pretty wonderful when you think about it.
I want to ask you a question. It's so fascinating because it's worlds within worlds,
Yes.
and so there's a secrecy and a kind of a code, if you will, right? And so, but I want to jump to a different topic, which is
Sure.
Pocahontas. I
Yes.
want to, who I know you think a lot about. What talk about Pocahontas? I mean, who was she really, and why has it become this? What does she stand for? What is the story here, and how can we learn from it? How can we draw parallels to Pocahontas?
In some ways, I think it was my work on the history of Pocahontas that helped to and sort of kindled my enthusiasm when I discovered the Aztec sources. Because in the case of Pocahontas, we don't have any writings. It's kind of the opposite world. Rather than having lots and lots of material, we have almost nothing. In fact, she herself, I believe, and as far as we know, wrote nothing. She certainly became fluent in English, but we don't know that she was ever taught to read and write, although they perhaps, but there's nothing left. So when I turned to writing about Pocahontas, this was years ago, I turned to a project that many people thought could not be done and told me could not be done because there are quote unquote no sources. What I ended up doing was what I call triangulating in a sense. It's a study of context or almost of silhouetting around her. Um, what we do have are all the things that the Englishmen wrote about her. We also have her actions as a kind of a testimony. You know the old phrase, they voted with their feet, meaning they left that factory or that state or that county. Well, she voted with her feet in a certain sense several times. And then the third side of the triangle, if you will, is the writings or the comments made by Indian peoples in similar situations a few years later. So her story, I think, is important and emblematic in the sense that it does show us what can be done in trying to figure out an Indigenous person's point of view, even though we don't have their writings. She's a good case because she was famous to the English people of her time, so they commented about her a lot. She's a good case because she converted and married an Englishman, and we have the writings of other Indians who became Christians and married Englishmen. Okay. And then because she was so famous, what she did is quite well documented, so we have her actions too. So I was able, I think, to come a little closer. We'll never get inside her heart and mind. We don't have her diaries, but I was able to come a little closer than has been done often in the past to try to closer to the possibility of figuring out what it was she was thinking. An
Yeah.
example, it said, oh, she married a white man. She was in love with white men. She loved English culture. She went to London and loved London. This was pure projection, without looking at these contexts. Well, when you look more closely, you learn that the English took her prisoner, tried to convert her for over a year, and she steadfastly refused. You then learn that she was taken upriver and a messenger was sent to her father. Would they like her to marry an Englishman? He said yes, and we know from other Indians in similar situations that they said yes in those situations in order to make peace. The daughters of noblemen in the Indian world often married with the enemy. So most likely, since she suddenly says, okay, I'll marry an Englishman, she was doing this because it's what her father said to do, and most likely he was saying that because that's the reason they always had for such decisions. 3 days later, she suddenly converts to Christianity. She had refused for a year. She suddenly converts to Christianity. In that context, I think that action speaks loudly as a sort of the sealing of a political deal. Okay? We have what her husband said after the marriage, which was that he loved her and he was very happy with her. But as he put it, oh, these Indians, they do run headlong into damnation and with laughter. In other words, she wasn't listening to him. She was running headlong into damnation, doing whatever she wanted to do. So we have a little bit of a sense suddenly about why she might have chosen to marry this Englishman, what she thought she was doing and what it was like for her, even though we don't have her diaries. We don't have to assume that she was just a giddy girl wildly in love with all things English. We can look a little closer and see what we can come up with.
I just love the way you contextualize that, though. This idea that, You know, because I was thinking before you got on this call, the idea that sometimes the artifacts are destroyed in certain cultures, either intentionally, we have in certain parts of the world, we're going to, you know, we're going to destroy museums that hold these incredible artifacts that we need. So this idea of looking around and in silhouette, actually trying to piece together the story and yet never really knowing what's in the heart is beautiful thing to think about. Why do you think, though, she's such a legend in that way, and that Disney, you know, the Disney version, as you know, compared to, let's say, what Native Indigenous people feel about how she has been romanticized? Even this last point you just made is super important, that the shrewdness perhaps of sealing the deal or stopping war or making, you know, kind of some contract there is a much bigger idea.
Yeah, I think raising her significance now, both to the dominant culture and to Indigenous people, is very important. And boy, those two views are very different. In a way, I think Pocahontas is beloved by most of America for some rather painful reasons. That is, the dominant culture, that is most white Americans, I think, find it flattering, this old idea that she loved us. She was a good Indian. She understood the beauties and the virtues that the English were bringing. She wanted to marry an Englishman. She wanted to go to London. Well, that same old idea, as appealing as it is to members of the dominant culture for subconscious reasons, is very repugnant and even upsetting to Native peoples. And when I first went to Virginia, because there are state recognized tribes, including the Powhatan tribe, including her people's tribe, still there, several people on the Virginia Council of Indians were very upset. Oh no, another white woman who wants to write another book about Pocahontas, about this little giddy girl who loved white men. When they got to know me and got to see that that was not my agenda, that on the contrary, I was trying to figure out what her point of view is, then they really got into the project, and several of them read the book in manuscript form and gave me great feedback and great advice, really thoughtful commentary that was very helpful. But it's painful to them that the stereotyped Pocahontas, the mythical Pocahontas, is so popular because, again, it's sort of emblematic of the ways in which Indigenous people are supposed to look up to, even worship white people in that era, which wasn't true, but it's the memory that we have liked. Like we like the idea of Sacagawea, you know, helpfully guiding Lewis and Clark. We love that kind of Indian girl. And so it's painful to them that that's what we want. But I think that for many Indigenous people, the realization in the last couple of decades that their history can be written differently, especially if they participate in writing it, has made a big difference. And that they're now feeling much more interested in looking at these figures.
You know, how do you, when you start with a new figure, how do you try and, you know, like you say, you went there to talk about Pocahontas, they have an expectation that you're going to write the same story. So how do you always remove your own frame from what you're looking at, you know, when you start on a subject?
Right. And of course, I can't assume that I'm always really doing that. I'm probably not. Okay?
Right.
But I think that the times have changed enough that at the very least, I'm looking through a frame that is profoundly different from the older one. That is, let's stick to the case of Pocahontas for a moment instead of the Aztecs. In the case of Pocahontas, the story was framed for generations by white men, starting with John Smith himself, our most important source about her, and leading right up to Terrence Malick, who is brilliant, but basically wrote a white male fantasy about a 14, 15-year-old girl, or produced such a film. So that's the lens that has been out there. And when that is what you've had, just about any other lens may prove to be useful, or at least as illuminating and possibly more illuminating. I guess if there's a way in which I too am sort of just looking at it through my own point of view, it is as a woman. When I started these studies, I was a lot younger. And this was, you know, pre-Me Too. So I had my own stories of being accosted. And I think in that regard, felt a kind of click of sympathy, which you may say is partly imaginary. The Native American women might not have said, you know nothing about my experience, don't sympathize. But I nevertheless felt a kind of click of sympathy when I looked at, say, Pocahontas or Doña Marina, the woman who was forced to translate for Hernando Cortez. And that perhaps allowed me to begin to think about different possible ways of looking at their experiences. Meanwhile, other historians at that same time were also trying to think about how we might look at their stories from a different angle, and reading all of their work also inspired me. Again, do we have it right? No, we'll never get it perfectly right. Only they could tell us that story. But I think we're closer than we were 30 years ago, that's for sure.
Are
You
you
know,
worried about the lack, kind of where we are right now in kind of a lack of sort of intellectual curiosity, if you will, and that stories and histories are getting, they're getting lost in a way. Are they getting lost? And maybe they're not. It just might feel this way. And what happens if we let go of looking back and kind of trying to understand? You look at some of these uh, peoples that you've been studying. There's shared values. There's certain values about these people that are incredibly important. And why does history repeats itself? Why do certain populations get overtaken? You look at the indigenous Native Americans here, there's a gentleman, they have a perhaps, in my bias, a spiritual connection with the earth and other parts of life that we don't always value necessarily. So I don't really know what my question is, except that I worry that we're losing an interest, perhaps, in
It's
looking.
interesting. I feel split about this. That is, in some ways, the best historical work that's ever been done on this planet is starting to happen. I really believe that. Or it really started, say, 30 years ago, or even a little longer. Since since the multicultural wave kind of went through this country in the 1980s, since that time, um, there's been a perceptiveness about much of what gets written by historians that I think is really breathtaking. On the other hand, it's also become a highly professionalized field, and many historians write in such a way that most people, I was going to say, can't read it, wouldn't want to read it. Why would they? There's a tendency not to write in an accessible way, which I think is deeply unfortunate, because meanwhile, as you've alluded to, other forces are unfolding in this country um, that threaten the very idea that there is or should be a multiplicity of voices in our history, or a multiplicity of experiences that we should be interested in, even the ones that such people think they're interested in. Let us say John Adams and Tom Paine. Even those voices, such people don't tend to be very good listeners of. So they're likely to miss, people who think that's all we should listen to are likely to not even hear Tom Paine very well. So I I think we as historians have a responsibility to try to combat that, but more effectively than we have, because in the past, when we tend to try to speak up about that, it just raises the hackles of those who think history should be the study of Tom Paine and John Adams. And then a little battle happens, and it becomes politicized, and whichever party is in power in that state determines what's going to get taught for the next 10 years. So we have to do a better job of truly reaching people who are trying to approach history with what used to be called a tin ear, an insensitive ear, which
um,
is certainly happening. You're right.
when they fly the planes down in Mexico with LiDAR across the jungle, they come back showing these huge cities, these huge complexes that are gone now. They're still there, but they're gone to us. What do you think? What do you think happened? Why did they? Because we when we describe these complex social dynamics, like whatever that was, it was this incredibly rich society in some sense, and whatever it is down there now, it's not the same. So
Right.
what do you think happened?
Happened. I mean, it's one of the great ironies that I experience in my teaching when I do the sweep of time, because of course now Mexico and Central America are in such economic and political straits, and they're so often dismissed or treated disparagingly here, spoken of disparagingly. But of course, Mexico and Central America, that was the beating heart of this continent. That was the center of the world of this hemisphere. I shouldn't just say continent, this whole half of the globe. That was the kind of ancient Middle East, the sort of the fertile crescent of the New World was Mesoamerica and some surrounding areas too. And as you say, we don't even have excavated yet much of what exists there, or what once existed there. We know from the wall art of the Mayas, as well as the writings of the Aztecs, that they had an extraordinary and advanced culture and society. In terms of what happened, I would say, as in any part of the world, when you think about history, the various cultures or peoples that are present are always in competition with each other. And at different times, different ones are ascendant. So at one point, the Mayas were ascendant, what we call the classic Maya. Okay? At another point, a culture called Monte Alban was ascendant. In any event, when the Spaniards happened to come, when the two worlds, the East and West collided, the Aztec, or really Mexica, because as we said, the word Aztec is quite big, but so the Mexica civilization was ascendant, had dominated others. Others were reduced to either tribute payers or people who needed to kind of keep quiet in their now crumbling palaces off in those woods. Okay? And then, of course, the Spaniards conquered the Aztecs. So those other societies that might have been ascendant again one day, had the Europeans not come, just devolved into descended into poverty. Okay? Now, if you're asking, why were the Europeans able to conquer these civilizations? For that question, I must turn to the biologists, to the plant biologists. It's only in the last 20 years that this has been figured out, but we used to have no idea. Why had people in the old world, in Europe and Asia, started farming so much earlier? They did start farming in Mesoamerica. That's how we get the Olmecs and the Aztecs and the Mayas, et cetera. But at least 5,000 years later than in the old world. And the longer you're a farmer, the more technology you have, the more people you have, the more buildings, wheels, blacksmith shops, eventually ships, guns, compasses, all of it. It comes from being settled farmers, not hunter-gatherers. So the question for a long time is, why did people become farmers so much longer ago in Eurasia? And we had no good answers until about 25 years ago. Radiocarbon dating techniques improved drastically. And we were able to fine tune when bits of organic matter were where. It used to be that, oh, this piece of carbon dates to something within 1,000 years. That didn't help us. Once we could date it within a couple hundred years, you were able to figure out that basically people had become farmers in the parts of the world had become farmers first, in the parts of the world where the plants, there was a group, a constellation of plants that were very protein rich, and where it made sense then to stop hunting the deer and the rabbits and the squirrels, and instead to begin to become more permanent full-time farmers. It happened first in the Fertile Crescent. You will not be surprised. And what was there? It turns out that wheat and peas come from there. We didn't know that till we improved radiocarbon dating techniques. So then those plants can get borrowed by others, okay, and stolen by others and fought over by others. But the long and short of it is that they became farmers in the old world at least 5,000 years before people were able to do that in the new world. Corn is a good plant, but it's not a complete protein. They had tiny little kernels in the wild corn, teosinte, we call it. So the women had to plant those cobs and over time turn them into larger ears of corn. And then they had to discover, it took another 1,000 years or so, that you have to eat it with beans, because corn and beans together are a complete protein. And then they became full-time farmers. And lo and behold, you get Mesoamerican civilization. So there is a reason why the Eurasians were able to beat up on others when they began to spread outward from their continent. It has nothing to do with race or racism, fortunately.
No, were you the footprints in that they started to put hoof prints next to show their paths? Are you in a sense always chasing echoes of time to try and put the thing together? Is that how your mind works? And tell that story of the footprints.
Right. So in their writings, the writings that they used to do before the conquest, before they began to put things down alphabetically using the Roman alphabet, in those older writings, pictoglyphic or pictographic, they used footprints, an image of a footprint to show that people were wandering, that migrants were passing down these trails. Well, what is to me a fascinating switch or shift, after the Spaniards came, they still continued to produce some of those pictographic texts. But now they would put horseshoe prints, okay, moving down these paths or roads to show that people are on the move in these directions, okay. So it was their old idea, and yet with a modern, a new twist, an updated twist. And I would say, I don't know about I don't think I can say that I do that, but I can certainly say that the Aztecs did that regularly. That is, keep their own traditions alive and yet put in place something from the new world, something from the new inventions that they were being introduced to that they liked. So for example, instead of pictographic writing, let's transcribe sound. Or they used to have torches made of pine resin. They were very hard to handle or control. Well, they really liked candles with wicks that you could trim, et cetera. They said that this is the best thing the Spaniards ever brought us, okay? So they used them for what they used to use them for, certain tasks that they liked to do at night. But they could do those tasks better. Or farming. Now they had metal hoes, so they could do the same farming, farm the same crops, but more efficiently. So they were still true to themselves, to their own souls, to their own past. And yet they brought in and incorporated the new. They found that the new did not have to obliterate the old, just as we know. Now, whether that's me too, I don't think so. All I'm good at is sort of following them around, looking what they're doing. I'm not so sure I'm so good at keeping old traditions alive.
Yeah.
What is your next, what are you working on right now as we say goodbye? What are you working on right now specifically?
I've got two projects right now. One is a study of a set of family papers that come from a Native American family in Mexico in the 1600s. Most Native American families didn't keep a bunch of family papers, but this one did. And so I'm able to write the story of their family and their situation there in their town in Toluca in Mexico. At the same time, I'm working on something much closer to home. The Lenape Indians of the Northeast, of New Jersey and New York particularly, were forced eventually to go west. And they're known today as the Delaware, and they live in Oklahoma. Before they began to lose the language, before that began to die out among them, they actually invited some anthropologists to come among them in the late 1800s and early 1900s so that they could tell their histories and their stories and their religious tales to someone who would write them down in a book. Those papers unfortunately got put away in a drawer, so to speak. They've surfaced relatively recently. They're at the Smithsonian, and we're working on getting those published so that people will know more about the Lenape Indians.
Amazing. Keep doing what you're doing. We need you. We need people like you.
Well, thank you. It's fun.
Yeah, thank you for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. She was great. And I mean, her heart and her spirit. That's
So when people love what they do, they do
it's
great
really.
things.
I mean, that whole idea though of carving out from a silhouette is really, really brilliant. And to go back there and deconstruct, but also she was talking about Rashomon there, right? When every family had a different point of view about what they thought. But one thing I want to leave you with, corn is not a complete protein. So, you just need to think about that next time.
I'll give it some thought.
All right, see you later.
Call me later.
Bye.
Bye.